So unfortunately, we really are at a juncture where we have to decide between hegemony or balance of power, or continuing this very rich menu of topics, or eating lunch. So we're going to make this really quick. So kind of a lightning round, if you will. If there are questions from the audience, please, but make them really short and stand up at the mics. But I wanted to just connect the dots between these three wonderful presentations, if possible. Victor, you were able to talk a fair amount about how China is playing with North Korea. And I just wonder if I could draw you out a little bit on China's relations with the Republic of Korea, because I think that fits a little bit into these China asserting relationships with countries that are friendly to us, and that predicament of, is it a zero-sum game, or is there some more subtle coexistence of American and Chinese strategies? So you want to start there? Just
sure.
A few.
The relationship is complicated. There's been a lot of change there as well. We saw for a good part of last year a very overt punitive strategy by China to punish South Korea for allowing the emplacement of a THAAD battery in Songju, South Korea. But really it's actually all triggered by President Trump's decision to meet the North Korean leader. When he decided to meet the North Korean leader, I feel like China changed, and maybe they had already planned this at the National Party Congress, but Trump's decision accelerated their process. They really worked very quickly to normalize their relations with both North and South Korea. I already talked about North Korea. With South Korea, we've already seen that some of the pressure has come off with regard to THAAD, but I think the larger lesson there is that from the Chinese perspective, I think they always see the Korean Peninsula, in particular South Korea, in the broader strategic game as being in play. It is the frontline Cold War state for the United States alliance system, but because of domestic politics in South Korea, because of the deep ideological divide in South Korea between progressives and conservatives, which manifests itself in policy largely towards North Korea, as I said during my presentation, but also in some sense towards China. Just as an example, when China and South Korea signed a free trade agreement, there were no protests in the street. When we signed a free trade agreement with the United States and South Korea, there were lots of protests in the street. So there are a lot of elements like that that make the relationship much more complicated. And the Chinese, I agree entirely with Tan's comments about this sort of hierarchical view of Asia. Right? I think that is very true, and I think that's the way they view South Korea. And they also see opportunities because they know the South Koreans feel like they need China to resolve the North Korea issue, and so that is something that I think, and that we, the United States, have to be very proactive about. It's not something we can sort of sit and rest on our laurels and think the alliance is fine all the time.
Right. So we are running out of time. I'm going to invite Rich Kozlovich to ask a quick question, and anybody can answer it.
Rich Kozlovich, I'm an adjunct professor here at George Mason. One of the things that troubles me about your map is the division of the world according to U.S. combatant commands. And I think the one thing that was missing from the last discussion in particular was the role of Russia. And we've just seen these massive military maneuvers really pumped up in the press, and I don't see how you could talk about Korea or indeed, the strategic importance of China without introducing the Russian dimension.
Okay, thank you. It's an interesting thought. We did look at a number of other maps, and just without thinking too much about Russia, what we liked about what should be, of course, the Indo-Pac Command map is that there was room for Australia, and I can't tell you how many political maps of Asia sort of cut off. Poor Australia and New Zealand are barely included. I'm really going to have to call this, I think, to a close. Very, very quickly, just ask your question, and I'll let the panelists make any final thoughts they have.
Hi, Lee Roberts, adjunct faculty here. It'd be interesting to know what you think unintended consequences may be for tensions between India and China of the pact that the U.S. and India reached yesterday.
Please.
Okay, my name is Hong. I'm a PhD student here. So my question to Dr. Cha, I wonder what's your interpretation of the underlying dynamic between recent development of the China-North Korea relationship? Because there's, as you know, the leading Chinese experts on North Korea, Shen Zhihua, has argued that China has stopped being an ally, or North Korea has stopped being an ally of China, and the whole and it was triggered. The recent development was triggered by the symmetry between President Trump and Kim Jong Un, and that China realized that China has lost in the triangular relationship. And China worries about a situation like the next moment when China was worried that it is losing out in this new development. So I wonder, what's your interpretation? Which party, China or North Korea, is coming out, getting an upper hand in the relationship?
Thank you. We might, and if anybody wants to take on the India question, I think we might have a chance to talk about it in our final session. But anyway, Victor, a quick answer, and if Mike or Yun want to come in as well, let us know.
So I mean, the question of who, it's hard to answer the question definitively of who has the upper hand. I mean, structurally, China has the upper hand. I mean, you know, the North Koreans are entirely dependent on China. At the same time, though, there are a lot of things that the North Koreans do. Every time the North Koreans do something bad, it makes China vulnerable, and there's not a whole lot they can do about it. So it's sort of the tail wagging the dog in that sense as well. But I do think that special relationship, as talked about in the past, has been renewed. Even though Xi Jinping is not going this week, to the 70th anniversary celebrations, I still think it's been renewed, largely because of Trump's decision to meet Kim Jong-un. And then on Russia, the only thing I'll say there is that Russia is not out of this picture at all. I mean, the Eastern Economic Conference, I think, is next week in Vladivostok, and it wouldn't surprise me if Kim Jong-un went. Putin had a very good relationship with Kim Jong-un's father. He's actually the only leader to have a good relationship with Kim Jong-un's father. And Russia has a great deal of interest in the progressive South Korean government's idea of building infrastructure links going all the way up the peninsula, rail and energy links going all the way up the peninsula. So, and Russia has a very, very strong interest in that. So they're not out of the picture at all.
Any final thoughts?
I refuse to stand in the way of lunch.
I'll try to stand in the way of lunch a little bit. I think on the issue of Russia, I agree with Victor completely that Russia is not out of the picture at all. And in fact, if you look at what the Chinese have been arguing about the Korean Peninsula, they have been also finger pointing at Russia for having trade with North Korea when China was under the pressure to put more sanctions on it. However, one thing that I will point out is that Russia and China have very different endgame visions for the Korean Peninsula. For the sake of the infrastructure development that Russia wants to promote, Russia is actually okay with unification with the Korean Peninsula. And its opposition to the unification is much less compared to China's opposition to the unification of the Korean Peninsula. So I think that's a significant distinction that people don't usually talk about. On the issue of India, I've been doing research on this topic at Stimson Center. First of all, India's principle of foreign policy is a strategic autonomy. And there have been this debate when the Quad was first proposed whether India was going to form an alliance or alignment with the United States. And when I visited Delhi and talked to their foreign ministry, they also have questions about the credibility of the Trump administration. They don't know how long this strategy can be sustainable, since how often that President Trump seems to change his mind. So from their perspective, to completely align themselves with the United States to antagonize China in the long run is not necessarily good policy. There's the issue of Iran, which will be a issue of dispute between U.S. and India, given how much crude oil that India imports from Iran. And India is also investing in Chabahar, the port in Iran as well. Last but not least, I would say that between China and India, there's also the uncertainty of what Imran Khan's policy will be towards India. He has reached out to India with the olive branch. We don't know what that policy will look like, but China has played a quite significant role in that process.
Very helpful. Okay. Admiral Blair is here, so I know we'll be able to start our next session. We'll cut 5 minutes into your presentation.